So Jesus and the disciples got into a boat. Doesn't that sound like the start of a joke? Sort of like the priest and the rabbi and whatever went into a whatever. Once you get to reading the gospel stories about Jesus, though, it strikes you about his earthly ministry. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they spent a lot of time not only up in the northern part of Israel, the area we know as Galilee, but they spent a lot of time by and on the surface of the Sea of Galilee, going here and there. The Sea of Galilee is a large freshwater lake. It's 13 miles long north to south. At its widest point, it's 7 miles wide east to west. It sits, believe it or not, 700 feet below sea level. And yet it's a freshwater lake that's teeming with life. And so in that time when Jesus was on earth, fishing was an important part of people having food to eat and everything else that was going on in that time. And as we have seen, Peter and Andrew, James and John, they were fishermen on the Sea of Galilee. And they probably, after they had left their fishing boats and had begun to follow Jesus, whenever they would come back to the Sea of Galilee, I would think that one of them or another would take the tiller of the fishing boat. And maybe one of them would man the sail as they went here and there across mainly the north side of the lake, of the Sea of Galilee. Those water journeys have factored into many of the events that we've talked about the last 3 weeks as we've been looking at Jesus and his life and his ministry, and we have sort of a slant that we're looking at as we go through this. We're looking at this ministry of Jesus as he molds and shapes his apostles, specifically the fellow named Simon Peter, and how God is molding him, preparing him and the others for ministry after Jesus has completed his earthly work and has returned to his Father. So many times they would go out on the lake, and today we look at what was evidently the last such trip they took together with Jesus on the Sea of Galilee. We're going to be looking in Matthew chapter 16 today. After this journey and the things that transpired on it, Jesus' attention was going to turn south. It was going to turn toward Jerusalem, where in a short time he would be betrayed and arrested, tried and convicted in a kangaroo court, crucified as a criminal, and then on the third day rise again. Once they returned from this trip to their home base at Capernaum, which you'll read that is sort of toward the last of chapter 17 that they get back there, the Sea of Galilee is going to be left behind until after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. We read in John chapter 21 how some of the apostles, including Peter, go back to the Sea of Galilee, go fishing one more time, and have an encounter with the risen Lord Jesus there on the shore. As we saw in Matthew 14 last week, even when they got into a boat there on the Sea of Galilee, it was hard for Jesus and his apostles to sort of get away from people. They'd get in the boat and they'd start to work their way down the shoreline, and some of the faster people, they would run and others would walk, and they could go to a place that was rather sparsely populated, and by the time they got there, there were thousands on the shore waiting on them. It was hard for them to get time alone. But here in chapter 16, Jesus is set on spending some serious time with the 12, just them. And so they set their course for farther away to the region where the headwaters of the Jordan River, they come from springs, and they fall as waterfalls into the northern side of the Sea of Galilee. It's the region, it's full of history, but it's not Jewish history. It's pagan history. It's Roman history. It's the region of Caesarea Philippi. And the name tells you everything you need to know. Caesarea, from Caesar, the Roman emperor, correct? And then Philippi, Philip the Tetrarch. He was a grandson of Herod the Great. Herod the Great's the fellow that was over the region when Jesus was born. And what's his claim to fame? He had all of the boys under 2 years old in Bethlehem murdered, didn't he? Trying to wipe out Jesus. This is his grandson, Philip the Tetrarch. And so he's had this city built up. It was an ancient city. He's had it built up, and he's named it Caesarea, trying to earn favor with Caesar, and he's named it also after himself. And so it's a place where Jewish people really don't go very much. But they have gone to that region to get away. And there, before things really started to get hot and heavy, and they started working their way toward Jerusalem, Jesus offers a midterm exam of sorts. A midterm exam of their time with Him as His disciples. He challenges their preconceptions. He checks their understanding. He introduces the terrible next step of God's plan for him, what He's going to go through for them and for us. And then He lays out the strategy they're going to have to make their own if they're going to continue to walk with Him. All four of these things are still important today. We'll be looking at each of them this morning as we work our way through the chapter. But let's listen in as Jesus introduces the first topic He wants to discuss with them. It's Matthew 16, beginning in verse 5. When they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. "Be careful," Jesus said to them. "Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." They discussed this among themselves and said, "It is because we didn't bring any bread." Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked, "You have little faith, why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? How is it that you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread? But be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." And then they understood that He was not telling them to guard against the yeast using bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. They're not even to Caesarea Philippi yet. They're on the water. And when we put together Mark and Luke's accounts of this same story, we discover that somewhere along the way, as they set out on this trip, and this trip is going to last somewhere over a week before they come back, they realize, "You got some bread, right, didn't you?" "No, I thought you were getting some bread." "What about you?" "I brought 1 loaf." And so they're getting sort of worried about it. They've got 1 loaf of bread for 13 of them for about a week, and they're getting a little nervous. And that's on their mind when Jesus speaks of the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. He knows, doesn't He? He always knows. But Jesus tells them, "I'm not talking about bread." And then he reminds them, "You've already witnessed 2 incredible miracles. We have fed thousands, and there's been basketfuls left over from not much more than what you got right there." We talked last Sunday as we looked at chapter 14 about the impact that had to have on these guys, because Jesus blessed the little pieces of bread, the little loaves, and the little fish, and He broke them and He gave them to the disciples. And I told you, I'm convinced that the miracle, the multiplication, happened in their hands. As they broke and they gave, they broke and they gave, it kept on multiplying, and here it is right here in their hands. And He goes, "Don't you remember how quick you forget?" That's not at all what I'm talking about. Jesus says, "I'm not worrying about bread. I'm worrying about yeast. I'm warning about yeast, the stuff that puffs it up, that changes its feel, changes its texture. And in fact, I'm not worried about yeast that goes into bread, or at least they figured it out later. Yeast has a major part to play in the Jewish heritage. And that's because when their forefathers were in slavery in Egypt and they were seeking to get out, they were wanting their freedom, and Moses is going back and forth to Pharaoh. Finally, the 10th plague is coming, the plague that's going to have them sacrifice a lamb or a goat and smear the blood on the doorpost and the lintel. And the instruction comes, tell the people to make bread without yeast, because they don't have time to put the yeast in the dough and let it rise. They're going to make bread without yeast. And in fact, from then on, God says to Moses, this is going for time immemorial, going to be a memory for your people, that they're going to eat this certain time of year, bread without yeast, to remember I delivered their forefathers from slavery in Egypt. And so even today, observant Jews, they don't use yeast in their bread 7 days in a row during the Passover season and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. They remember, they celebrate what God did for them. Jesus does use yeast one time as a positive example, but the rest of the time, including here, it's negative. It's a negative force. He's warning the disciples not to let their faith, their religion, their walk with God to be contaminated by either of two corrupting influences. And he names these two groups that were very prominent in the day, very prominent in their opposition against Jesus. The first was the Pharisees. The Pharisees majored in the minor things. Theirs was a yeast of religious performance. You might remember coming across Jesus saying something like this: you Pharisees, you tithe the herbs out of your garden, but you don't do the weightier things of the law, like justice. It's all about performance for you. Follow the rules to a T, feel good about yourself. God is happy with that. He says, watch out for that. That'll contaminate you. And then he also talks about the yeast of the Sadducees. They had a different sort of yeast. They had no problem connecting their religion to the pursuit of earthly power. The chief priests of the Jews were all Sadducees, one after another. They were cozier than they wanted to admit with the Roman government. They liked power. It was a religion of power, because when you get the power, you get to make the rules. They had a political bent to their religion. And so Jesus is saying here to his disciples and to us, we need to check our preconceptions, because true religion is not going to be either of those. In fact, James, his half-brother, would later write in James 1:27 that true religion that is undefiled is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Pretty simple, isn't it? Don't fall for the religious performance trap. Don't fall for the earthly power trap. Well, that's his number one point. Let's on to subject two. We're trying to move through this chapter pretty quickly today. Once the boat had arrived in the region of Caesarea Philippi, Jesus asked a couple of questions about himself, and we read that beginning in verse 13. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Now, Jesus' identity had been the subject of speculation far and wide for his entire ministry, a couple of years now. His power was undeniable. His gift of teaching was out of this world. But his profile, it didn't seem to line up with the popular conception of people about who their Messiah was going to be and how he was going to act. But you see, his disciples have been walking with him. They've been listening to him. They've been watching him at work, and they've been growing in their understanding. Back in chapter 14, the last of the passage we looked at last Sunday, after Jesus has walked on the water, Peter has tried and sort of failed, and they've gotten into the boat. It says that the disciples said to him, "Truly you are the Son of God." No one else could walk on the water like that. So they're almost there. But then here, Peter adds a little more. He declares openly for the very first time, "You are the Messiah, the Christ. You're the promised one we've all been looking for." And you see, his is the first confession of Christ. It's the first stone to be set on the cornerstone that is Jesus laying down his life for us. And the Bible tells us, it gives us this beautiful picture that as people turn to Jesus and they come to follow him, we're being built into a building, living stone upon living stone. And when we add our confession of faith, we're being built into that building as well. Peter himself would later describe this process in 1 Peter 2, verses 4 and 5. "As you come to him, the living stone, rejected by humans but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ." This is one of many reasons why we can't really say that I'm a Lone Ranger Christian. Because no, I'm another rock in the wall, to paraphrase old Pink Floyd and what they sang. Starting with Peter in that day, Jesus built his church on this one confession. Jesus is the Messiah. He's the promised Savior. Now, later, when the pressure was on, even though Jesus had told him and he said, "I'm not going to do it," he denied Jesus 3 times, didn't he? But he still believed. He was just afraid. And he went out and he wept bitterly. And later, Jesus restored him. But we need to understand, just like Jesus, there is a confession to be made. And like it or not, there is no other solid ground. There is no other name given among men by which we must be saved. Acts 4:32 tells us. After that great confession, Peter must have felt he was on a roll. He sort of felt big. He'd gotten patted on the back in front of all the other guys, right? But what happened next brought him right back down to earth, because Jesus began to share what's going to happen to him, what's going to go on next. And Peter dared to rebuke the one he had just said, "You're the Messiah." Verse 21, back here in Matthew 16. "From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and on the 3rd day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Now, we don't have the time to go into Peter's motivation at this moment. Was Satan speaking through him, or did Peter's rebuke simply remind Jesus of the same sort of voice he heard in the wilderness when he went through his great temptation? We don't know, and really that isn't too important. What is important is that Jesus let Peter, and he lets us know that the way of the cross is the only way to set us right with him. It had to be the cross. As Hebrews 9:22 says, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. No matter how much the message of the cross might offend modern sensitivities, we are not free to rewrite Jesus' story. We must accept the fact that he died that death, that awful death, for us. Our sin put him there. And through faith in his death and resurrection, we all can receive the gift of eternal life. It's the only way. Peter, I know that you think that some other way would be better, but trust me on this. This is the only way. And then there's one more thing that Jesus wanted to impress on his disciples there in Caesarea Philippi, and it was this: his way needed to become their way. His way needed to become their way. Look at verse 24. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done." Now, this is the sort of hard passage that it is tempting to pass over. It doesn't fit real well with those who their main message is that following Jesus will give you your best life now. Because here, he says, "You going to follow me? Imitate me. Imitate me. Enter into my world. Enter into my sort of life. Here's what you got to do. You deny yourself. You deny putting yourself on top. You take up your cross." And Luke adds, "daily. And you follow me." You follow me. It's a life of sacrificial service. Sometimes it's called the cruciform life. That means the cross-shaped life. There's from where we stand, and you look at the cross, you up in service to God, out in service to humanity. Deny yourself, take up your cross daily, follow me. That's what it's got to be. And notice that the payout Jesus promises isn't today. It isn't tomorrow. It is when the Son of Man comes in his Father's glory. That could be tomorrow, but it might be 1,000 years from now. We've got to decide to believe he is faithful. What is at stake with following Jesus in this way? Is it to have bragging rights? No, you get bragging rights by being a good Pharisee or by being a good Sadducee, right? Either you're the one that's squeaky clean over here, does everything just right, or you're the one with all the power, and so everyone bows down to you. No. What's at stake, says Jesus, is our soul, our very self. In the parable of the rich fool, who dies even as he plans to hoard his wealth, to build bigger barns to keep his crops in. God says to him, "You fool, this very night your life," and it's the same word that's here translated soul, "will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?" And then Jesus made the application of that parable. He said, "This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. If you don't deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me." And so here at this crucial point in his ministry, in his time on earth, as he's about to start heading south, heading to Jerusalem, heading to the cross, he has this midterm exam for his disciples. And it's an exam for each of us who follow him too. And he asks, who's in? Who's in? And he reminds us, we need to check our preconceptions. What are we all about? We better not be like the Pharisees, just about religious performance. We better watch out being about like the Sadducees, just looking for power. Check your preconceptions. He reminds us that our only hope is to stand on the confession, Jesus is the Messiah. We've got to embrace God's plan, even if it's a little rougher than we really want, because the cross is the only way of salvation. That's how desperately wicked I am and you are. And then we need to embrace the plan. Follow the way of Jesus, the way he followed. We need to deny ourselves, take up our cross daily, and follow him in service to God and to others. Who's in? Who's in? I'm in. I pray you are.